Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Anya Taylor-Joy stars in the latest adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma. Emma Woodhouse, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, fancies herself as a matchmaker, and when Harriet Smith, played by Mia Goth, arrives at Hartfield House, Emma befriends her and sets to match her with Vicar Mr. Elton, played by Josh O'Connor. But Emma's manipulations are chastised by Mr. Knightley, played by Johnny Flynn, and when Mr. Churchill, played by Callum Turner, arrives for a visit, Emma begins to have romantic feelings of her own that make her question whether she truly knows best in affairs of the heart. Emma, is of course based on Jane Austen's 1815 novel, which was the last one published in her own lifetime. This newest adaptation is directed by Autumn de Wilde, who is making her film debut here, but is a well-known photographer. In fact, she even did the photography for the film's poster art. Now, you may be somewhat surprised to hear this, but this is only the fourth film adaptation of Emma. All the versions before that were made for television, and it took until the mid-90s before it made the leap onto the silver screen. It did that properly with 1996's Emma, starring Gwyneth Paltrow, made for Miramax. And I watched that for this review, and that's a very solid, straightforward, right down the middle adaptation that's very formal and classical in its approach. But I do have to be honest, I found it quite flat, and that's a strange thing to say considering that it has a very starry cast that includes Toni Collette, Ewan McGregor and Alan Cumming, but I don't feel it really captures the wit of Austen's prose. There's a lot of room for improvement. Of course, many people are aware of another version of Emma, even if they don't necessarily know that it is, and that's 1995's Clueless, which again, I watched for this review for the first time, and let me tell you, that holds up really well. Using Austen's story and relocating it to Los Angeles as a satire on Valley Girls is really sharp and really clever, and I think because they used Austen's story as a basis, that's why it's so timeless in a lot of ways. That movie has really aged very well in a lot of regards. I think that's much closer in terms of actually capturing the humour of the source material than the actual proper version of Emma starring Gwyneth Paltrow. But if you took those two versions and smashed them together, chances are you'd probably create something like this 2020 film. You can almost instantly tell this film is made by a photographer because its first most immediate pleasures are visual. This is a gorgeous looking movie. I'm talking about the cinematography, the production design and the costuming, which are all very deliberate and very heightened in their own ways. It definitely reminded me of a Wes Anderson movie. There's a clear influence there, especially in the way the film is chaptered for the seasons, like you would see in an Anderson film, but in the general visual approach as well, which really prioritizes a lot of bright, strong colours like yellows and greens and pinks, and the costuming integrates that as well. There's a lot of a period appropriate clothing, but done in very bright colours that makes it very distinct, but also very modern feeling at the same time. And then at certain moments, it just goes all out ridiculous. Bill Nighy at one point walks in wearing this two-piece patterned suit, and because he's Bill Nighy, he pulls that look off, but that is almost farcical, but that's by intention, because clearly the idea here is to take that period aesthetic, but push it to its absolute extreme. And I think this is to make it more accessible to the audience. It very clearly communicates that this is a very broad, very comic environment, but also very sunny and welcoming in its own way. And then you've got all the actors photographed in it, and all the shots are really well composed. It's a real treat for the eyes a lot of the time. You'll enjoy looking at it, I found. And that's what Austen is all about. It's all about manners and proper decorum, and placing that in this kind of environment almost puts a spotlight on everything. It becomes virtually a running gag of characters brushing up against the rigid social conventions of the time and being very awkward about it. For example, Emma's father and Mr. Knightley are speaking, they go to sit down, oh, one of us has started speaking again, gotta stand up. Okay, you're sitting down, no, one of us has started speaking again, gotta stand up. Likewise, there's a really clever, very well thought out running gag involving involving Emma's father, who likes to use screens for the fireplace, which can also be used in quite symbolic ways as well. As true with any Austen adaptation, it's not really about what's said so much as what isn't. It's all about little gestures, and even the slightest transgression from the accepted behaviour can be quite telling and potentially very harshly criticised. And certainly it's about people trying to express feelings that they are not allowed to say, although it has to be said that in terms of Austen adaptations, this version of Emma is positively lustful. It's not even 10 minutes in before Mr. Knightley walks in and completely disrobes and bares his bottom. Later on, there's a sequence where Emma is very seductively eating a strawberry as Mr. Knightley watches on. That's not very subtle by any stretch of the imagination, but it very much gives you an idea of how much there is romantically and sexually going on under the surface, even though this is ostensibly quite a buttoned up world. And it's all directed with a very light touch. De Wilde understands that this is a frivolous story by design. It's set in the fictional village of Highbury, where the most important thing going on in that world is the gossip of the romances of the wealthy. Even Isabel Waller-Bridge's score accentuates this. It sounds very fanciful. In fact, I particularly like the theme for Emma, which sounds very carefree, which is appropriate considering that the character is 21 and has had nothing to vex her yet, as sampled by the opening text. And I do think that the movie has the right kind of attitude to it. It feels like you're at an afternoon high tea, especially in the way that there's so many various cakes and patisseries in many of the scenes. I gotta be honest, because the film is so colourful in its own way, it almost reminded me of a macaroon. It's very weird to compare a film to that, but honestly, that was what I was thinking at the time. In the lead role, Anya Taylor-Joy is terrific as Emma. She does a fantastic job capturing all that character's qualities. She's young, she's headstrong, she's very smart, and also extremely perceptive. It feels like she's watching the room at all times, but also doesn't shy away from Emma's more negative qualities, like the fact that she's obviously very manipulative, she's quite spoiled and privileged, and also can be very cruel. That means that Emma can be an unlikable character, but Taylor-Joy remains charming throughout. She is watchable and compelling even when Emma is at her very worst. And Emma is a character that is filled with the arrogance of youth. She's 21, she thinks she knows exactly how the world works, and because she comes from such a wealthy background, she thinks that she can use people and play around with them as if they were toys, and begins to realise over the course of it that people don't work in exactly the way that you expect them to, and maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't interfere in other people's affairs. That's where a lot of the comedy lays, but also some of the drama as well. It's a character essentially learning to discover that maybe, just maybe, she cannot assert her superiority onto others. What also helps Taylor-Joy, though, is that she has such great chemistry with Johnny Flynn as the extremely critical Mr. Knightley. And the musician-turned-actor is similarly brilliant, just as he was in Beast a few years ago, and has such an assured screen presence, cutting this rugged masculinity that's ideal for a romantic hero. When those two characters are bickering and arguing, it's fun because of the energy they bring to those roles. And one of the film's pleasures, as it should be in a romantic comedy, is seeing that relationship evolve over time. And certainly, as you understand that Mr. Knightley may be staunchly critical of Emma, but that's also because he can see the very best of her, and there are qualities that he admires and respects about her. And he also isn't above fault, because once Mr. Churchill arrives on the scene, he can be very, very obviously jealous, and there are clear notes of that in Flynn's performance. Unfortunately, Callum Turner doesn't get as much room to shine in the role of Churchill, and that's because that character gets the short shrift in this adaptation. Admittedly, he is something of a tricky one because he arrives in the story so late. Nevertheless, I just didn't believe the love triangle that's established between him, Emma, and Mr. Knightley. I never really thought that Emma would run off with him in the end. He never felt like a worthy suitor, and that's because the character doesn't feel very distinctive. At least in Ewan McGregor's case in the 1996 film, he had that awful wig. It might not have stood out for the right reasons, but it certainly made him pronounced, whereas this Churchill is rather forgettable, and that's not really Turner's fault. In fact, it's actually quite a departure from many of the roles I've seen him in previously. You might recall him from the recent BBC series The Capture. It just didn't work for me, and that's a shame because he's the only member of the supporting cast that fell flat for me. Mia Goth is a revelation in this film as Harriet. She is so good at handling the comedy of this clueless and slightly naive character that Emma starts taking control over, but also the friendship between them is very convincing on screen, which helps because apparently Anya Taylor-Joy and Mia Goth are friends in real life. They previously worked on the movie The Secret of Marrowbone together, and I think that Goth is the genuine surprise in this film. I've never seen her give a performance quite like this one before. Likewise, Josh O'Connor absolutely steals scenes as Mr. Elton. He is incredibly overeager and very, almost lascivious to a certain extent, very eager to please. He has a fantastic scene where he creates this incredibly over-elaborate frame. The scene that carries that he shares with Emma is one of the movie's very best scenes because O'Connor is absolutely hysterical in it, as is Taylor-Joy, especially with a look of mounting horror as she realises what's happening. That is just some very well played comedy there. Miranda Hart very much stands out in the role of Miss Bates, who is very chatty, very talkative, but also rather dull, and Hart manages to mine quite an amusing little character out of her relatively small, cosy ways. But in the crucial key moment in the narrative where that character comes to the forefront, she's also remarkably moving as well. She definitely sells just how incredibly degrading that moment is. If you're familiar with the story, you know exactly which one I'm talking about, and this version definitely makes that feel incredibly powerful on screen, and Hart is a big reason why that works as well as it does, and it shows that she can be a really accomplished performer, not just doing broad comedy. Finally, we have Bill Nighy in the role of Emma's father, which is a fairly small peripheral role in the grand scheme of things, but when you cast someone like Nighy in that part, he brings his level of personality to it that makes it distinct. He is in scenes without really saying anything, but he can get a laugh with the merest inflection or gesture, and adding that level of kind of quirkiness to the character is perfectly suited for this kind of offbeat adaptation. Unfortunately, if there is a problem with this movie, it comes down to the pacing. The movie starts out very strong, in large part because of its visuals, the snappy dialogue and performances, but over time you do start to feel De Wilde's grip start to waver, and there are definitely pockets where it starts to flag somewhat, especially in the second half. I think that after Mr. Churchill arrives, it's not quite as sure-footed as it's set out, and this is largely an issue with being a first-time director. It just speaks to inexperience, and it's a shame because otherwise this is very confident in its approach. At just over 2 hours, that is a lot of running time for what is a movie that doesn't really aspire to have all that much substance to it, and I do think it would have benefited from just slightly tightening up. I quite liked this version of Emma. I think it's far superior to the 1996 film and a lot more accessible to boot. The way that it's so stylised, almost to the point of being arch, is a great way of tackling source material that can be quite formidable, especially for newcomers. I think that it's very much in keeping with the text, while also being very modern. And if you're new to Emma, I think that you'll enjoy this movie. I think that you'll laugh along with it, because it really does a great job of capturing the comedy and the wit of Austen's writing and really putting across its central satire. Do I think this is a definitive adaptation? I think there is still potentially room for a better version, but this does have a lot of strengths, especially those lead performances from Johnny Flynn and Anya Taylor-Joy. That being said though, I think the best version of Emma on screen is probably still Clueless, but hey, this would make a great double feature with it. Emma is an amusing update to the Jane Austen story, in large part due to Autumn de Wilde's stylised approach to the material that subtly modernises it whilst also amplifying and exaggerating its comedy of manners. This version is beautifully photogenic, as you would expect from a film directed by a photographer, but aware of the story's lightness by putting a heavy emphasis on the humour, creating a confection that resembles the cakes and patisseries in many of its scenes. Anya Taylor-Joy is brilliant as Emma, at once youthful and charming but also spoiled, and she has great chemistry with a ruggedly handsome Johnny Flynn, while Josh O'Connor and Mia Goth are very funny in key supporting roles, and Bill Nighy adds some of his eccentric flavour to the minor role of Emma's father. While the film does suffer from pacing issues and the 2-hour running time is overindulgent for a relatively slight plot, it manages to capture Austen's wit while also making it broadly accessible and romantic. If you like this review, then you'll find your perfect match with my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.